Hi, my name's Ichban, and today we're going to be talking about shallow depth of field in photography, how to achieve it, and when to best use it. So firstly, what is depth of field? Depth of field generally refers to the areas of a photograph that are sharp and in focus relative to the rest of the image. Shallow depth of field, for example, is when there's a narrower focal plane of what's sharp and in focus, with the rest of the image rendered beautifully soft and blurry, also known as bokeh. Take these photos for example. The subject is nice and sharp and the rest of the image is nice and soft. On the other hand, deep depth of field is when all or the majority of your image is sharp and in focus. Think images you often see coming from a smartphone where everything is in focus from the front all the way to the back. Shallower depth of field, if used with intention, is a powerful photography and storytelling technique that can be used to guide your viewer's eyes through the image. In this video, we're going to be going through the different ways to achieve a shallow depth of field and the pros and cons of using it. There are a few ways to achieve a nice shallow depth of field. The first way is to use a high quality lens with a wide maximum aperture. This is the f number or f-stop, which can usually be found inscribed on your lens. This lens, for example, is a 35mm f1.4, which is perfect for creating a shallow depth of field. A lens with a wider aperture or lower f-stop number allows more light into the camera, which creates this shallow depth of field effect. Alright, I'm going to show you how depth of field looks through the entire aperture range starting from 1.4 all the way to 16. We're using my good friend Demis as the test subject today. And the lens we'll be using is a 35mm 1.4, which is perfect for shallow depth of field. With the aperture set to 1.4, the shallow depth of field effect is quite pronounced. Demis is sharp and in focus, and the background is rendered nice, soft and blurry. Pay close attention to the background as I increase the aperture. Alright, let's go from 1.4 to 2.8. 4, 5.6. This is as far as I'd recommend to go, as you can already tell this is the limits of shallow depth of field. From here it'll diminish even more. Alright, so let's go on to 8, 11 and 16. By this point practically everything is sharp from front to back, and this is what I would call deep depth of field. Here's a quick comparison of the two extremes, f16 and f1.4. Which one do you prefer? I would recommend shooting with an aperture of 1.4 to 5.6, which will narrow your plane of focus. So what exactly is your plane of focus? It's a simple yet important concept to understand in depth of field. Let me explain. Alright, so there's some math involved, but to keep it simple, depending on the lens and aperture you're using, in this case a 35mm at 1.4, there will be an area or focal plane where everything within that plane will be in focus. Everything outside of that focal plane will be out of focus and blurry. This could be the foreground or the background. Pretty simple, right? As you increase the aperture from say our current 1.4 to 5.6, the focal plane or the area which is in focus grows in depth. Now you have more in focus and less of a blurry background. Increase the aperture to the maximum of f16 for example, and basically everything is in focus. Another way you can achieve and enhance the shallow depth of field effect is to play with the distances between your camera, your subject and the background. This can be very helpful if you don't have a lens with a wide maximum aperture. Depending on the camera and lenses you're using, playing with distances will definitely help to achieve a shallow depth of field. To demonstrate this to you, I'm going to keep the same aperture of 2.8 and move my subject around. So to increase or enhance shallow depth of field, you want to close the distance between your camera and your subject and increase the distance from your subject and the background. Notice how the depth of field changed quite dramatically just by moving the subject around and playing with distances. The camera settings were the exact same for all three shots. The focal length of your lens will also affect shallow depth of field. Take for example this 35mm lens, which is considered a wide lens, versus a 70-200mm lens. This telefocal 70-200mm lens, which is a lot more zoomed in, will have a much shallower depth of field compared to a wide 35mm lens. In this last example, we're using the same settings, an aperture of 2.8, and this is the 35mm versus the same settings on 200mm. See how big of a difference focal length can make? One thing to note is that shooting with a low aperture number allows more light into the camera. This means that you have to darken the image to compensate for that extra light. The few ways to do this is to use a lower ISO, which is the sensitivity of your camera sensor, using a faster shutter speed to allow less light in per shot, or using a neutral density or ND filter, which is essentially sunglasses for your lens, which cuts the amount of light allowed into the lens. So now that you know how to achieve a shallow depth of field, let's talk about the pros and cons of using shallow depth of field in photography. First of all, I personally love using this technique in my photography. It's just so aesthetic and nice to look at. The sharp and in-focus subject on a beautifully blurred background is always impressive. It's a great storytelling tool. Our eyes are naturally drawn to what's in focus, which makes this a great technique to draw the viewer's eyes to where you want in an image. You can highlight the subject and guide your viewer's eyes. This is great for controlling the narrative of your photo. This simultaneously allows you to pull attention away from the blurred parts of your image. Shallow depth of field also allows you to enhance the perspective of your subject and the environment. It can really help immerse you in the world of the character and the photograph. You can use it to isolate a subject from a crowd or a busy environment. It's great for portrait photography as it really draws you into the subject. It's also great for macro photography as it helps immerse you into the small macro world of your subject. As impressive as shallow depth of field photos look, I would recommend not getting too carried away with it. I'm personally guilty of this as sometimes I forget to use a high aperture. It's a pretty common issue for photographers to constantly use wide apertures, which is a problem as all your images over time will all look the same. There are uses for deep depth of field, say in a nature landscape shot where you want the viewer to be able to see everything from the front to the back. Product photography is also a great example of why you would want to use a deeper focus. For example, if you're shooting a product, you want the entire product to be in focus and not just the front part of it. It's important to remember to use shallow and deep depth of field with intention to enhance the photograph itself. I believe it's more important to choose the correct depth of field for the story you're trying to tell in the photograph you're taking. And that's all there is to it. I hope you've learned something about depth of field and shallow depth of field and go out there and try it for yourself. My name's Ichiban. See ya.